Hello, everyone, and welcome back yet again to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. Before we get into our second segment, I do want to remind you, as we get a tip from Tap to Learn of $10, thank you so much, Tap to Learn, for your continued support. That leads into my reminder that if you do feel so inclined, make yourselves available to all the features YouTube has to offer in terms of super chat, super thanks, and super stickers. You guys have been excellent so far on the show, so let's keep it going for this next segment. We transition kind of from wide receivers to tight ends, but before we get into that, I do want to address the comment right before the break from Greg Thurford in terms of him wanting Jefferson. That situation is kind of weird because I think Jefferson is someone who I might not want to take that high. And here's why. The QB situations. I really took Amon-Ra St. Brown where I was at 5, mainly because Jefferson, in my humble opinion, is a superstar. But the questions about Sam Darnold's consistency, the questions about, the whole profile of this offense do kind of concern me. And so that's why I was more comfortable taking Amon-Ra St. Brown, a player who's not potentially going to get more targets than a Justin Jefferson, but still gives you that balance and kind of experience and depth at the wide receiver position. So that's a fantastic point that in terms of trading up, you might want a superstar, but there are also options for you that high in the middle of the rounds where you can find value as well. So excellent point. Going into the world of tight ends. Tight ends, we've always talked about them in this show because it's taking a very interesting path where we have this youth movement of young tight ends coming into the league, making names for themselves. As Tap to Learn, fantastic commenter today. KOC is a QB whisperer. Darnold may ball. I'm not putting it past Kevin O'Connell to really coach up Sam Darnold, but my issue with Sam Darnold is how much value does he bring to this offense? And so, while I do think he's not necessarily going to have to worry too much about the weapons that he has because they're all excellent choices, I'm more worried about how he can maintain any modicum of success that he finds throughout the season. And I don't think Vikings fans really want this season to be any good. They want to kind of have this weirdly inconsistent season where they can either use draft capital to get more depth in terms of the draft and also just wait for J.J. McCarthy to be that guy for them. So while that's a fantastic point, I'm not necessarily certain Vikings fans agree with that sentiment or someone who is skeptical of his sustained ability to have success than people think. That's a good point. Fantastic comment from someone who has been fantastically commenting all episode long. Let's get into the tight end tiers. As I said, there are two pathways you can approach the tight end position. You can go young, and in this tier 1 between Laporta and Kelce, I like Kelce for at least one more season, but Laporta next year's value is going to skyrocket, especially if he has another breakout season. It was one of the worst tight end 1 campaigns from him last year, Laporta, but he still was the tight end 1. And as a rookie last year, let alone an offense like Detroit's that kind of wants that variability and verbiage, that was still very impressive. So this youth movement of tight ends you have to be very wary of, especially if you're someone who values tight ends at a premium. But tier 2 is where it gets interesting because it's a very kind of amalgamated mix of players. You have your Mark Andrews, George Kittle, Trey McBride, Dalton Kincaid, Evan Engram, and Kyle Pitts. Both young and old guys. Andrews and Kittle have been doing it for quite some time. They bring experience. Mark Andrews, though, does have an injury history. George Kittle, to a lesser extent as well, has an injury history. But I still think Kittle, out of both of them, is the better option out of the old guard. Then we look into the more new guard. I really like the upside of a guy like Trey McBride. And the Arizona Cardinals, yes, they drafted Marvin Harrison Jr. to add more depth to their wide receiver room, but Trey McBride is a sneaky threat, especially in PPR leagues, especially in terms of if you want that level of touchdown production as well that someone can provide. He's a red zone threat, and I think he's also going to be very sneaky in the open field as well. We talk about Dalton Kincaid. I believe that I picked him up in a mock draft a couple of weeks ago, and I was very excited about that prospect. Wasn't able to pick him up in my real draft, though. But Dalton Kincaid is certainly someone who I can see being in that tier 1, especially in about 3 to 4 years when Sam Laporta is presumptively the tight end 1 in this league. Him and Laporta certainly have very similar profiles. But in the Buffalo Bills offense, he's going to shine a lot. Because if they do kind of go less of a vertical route under Joe Brady in that offense, Dalton Kincaid can definitely work the middle of the field for Josh Allen, give him more short to intermediate area throws to get him more comfortable, because that was the problem with this Buffalo Bills offense. Josh Allen too often would go deep, try and find that deep ball, and it would fail. And this year, I think that Dalton Kincaid is going to be the X factor in this offense. Then we look at a guy like Evan Engram, who's definitely underrated because of the fact that in that Jacksonville Jaguars offense, he might just be the best pure receiver if you think about it. Because when I look at the Jacksonville Jaguars, and I've said this time and time again, speed does not help your quarterback. Speed only helps your quarterback if you know how to utilize it. And right now, I don't think they know how to utilize guys like Christian Kirk, a guy maybe like Brian Thomas Jr., who I do have high hopes for, but let's see how he just factors in. But Evan Engram has proven time and time again that as a pure route runner, he might be one of the best pure route running tight ends in the entire league. That's the only reason why I think that this offense has quote-unquote stayed afloat for Jacksonville as they try to get Trevor Lawrence to where they think he can be as a generational talent. And then last but not least, obviously, a lot of high hopes for Pitts as well. Kind of a lot of high hopes for almost every single one of these young Falcons skill position players, especially Bijan Robinson. When we look at Kyle Pitts, right, someone who was picked, I believe, at 5 overall in his draft class as a tight end, and not necessarily, living up to expectations. Maybe that's the fault of coaching. Maybe that's the fault of Arthur Smith. But you also kind of have to consider the fact that even though there was so much pressure on him, that pressure to deliver kind of has to translate. And it hasn't for me so far. And it hasn't for fantasy managers everywhere. So he seems like someone who will fall down a tier as well. Let me know what you think about that in the comments, because Kyle Pitts is someone who is very tough to analyze, because a lot of people might be saying, oh, I'm very high on him, but several others are going to be saying, well, there's more value in this tier 2, especially if I want to continue with this narrative of the old guard and pick guys like Andrews and Kittle for my team, and then maybe wait and see what Pitts is. As Shep Easy's Sweet Spot says, Pitts is now an IR Neverland. Cousins may help. We'll see with Pitts. I think that's the best way to assess him. As you allude to, Cousins coming in, I think may help him. But in terms of what I want to see from this Atlanta Falcons offense, especially that Kirk Cousins is a quarterback, I just want to see a better tempo to it. And I don't necessarily know how Pitts will fit into it. As Shapizi Sweet Spot also pointed out, he does have an injury history as well. I think that at this current moment in time, getting that tempo to your offense and figuring out who best profiles as someone who fits that narrative and can really help Kirk Cousins as he himself is coming back from injury, that's where you need to find your bread and butter if you're the Atlanta Falcons. I like each and every single one of these targets' raw potential. But right now, it is just potential. So, if Raheem Morris can truly figure out how to get the best out of everyone, get a nice tempo, because that's where I feel Cousins is comfortable. If it's more, anticipatory, more timing-based, then that's where I think Cousins may fail to deliver. If they can get a nice little tempo going, that's where I think every single weapon, especially Kyle Pitts, can be in business. But then let's go to tier 3, because you can find a lot of value as well here. These are more guys who I think are high-end tight end 2s, especially in Superflex or 12-man PPR leagues. These are guys who add a lot of production in certain areas of the field. You're talking about Jake Ferguson, you're talking about David Njoku, you're talking about a potential breakout star as well in Brock Bowers than Dallas Goedert, Pat Freiermuth, and TJ Hawkinson. The players who I really like, let's talk about Ferguson and Njoku, because they're both very versatile guys in respective traits. Ferguson, very powerful guy, very powerful in the red zone. David Njoku, my question about him, especially now that you have Lamar Jackson coming back from injury, my big question with him is whether or not he can sustain the level of play we saw from him in the playoffs and in the regular season when Joe Flacco was the quarterback for the Cleveland Browns. Because if he can get to that level, that speaks to how the Browns might evolve on offense and how the Browns might get the best out of Deshaun Watson, because I really like when Kevin Stefanski schemes up play action. We saw it in the Baker Mayfield era a little bit. I hope we see it even more with Deshaun Watson, because that's where I think he's most comfortable. Not to take away from Deshaun Watson, I know I'm rambling on about him a little bit because we're talking about tight ends here, but not to harp on that. But I think he will be more comfortable if he's running with the intention to pass than just running, even though that's one of his best traits. Now, David Njoku, going back to him, is also someone who profiles potentially as one of the better vertical threats on the Browns in a weird way. They brought in Jerry Jeudy, who can be interesting vertically, but hasn't really delivered to that point in Denver. And then you have Amari Cooper, who is getting up there in age. I just think that David Njoku is going to be someone who could potentially find himself in a higher tier. And then Brock Bowers is just a very hopeful prospect, in my opinion, because the Raiders right now don't necessarily fit the profile of a team that will want to throw the ball as much. He can be used in many different alignments. If Gardner Minshew finds a rhythm passing the ball as the starter. But at the end of the day, the bottom line is, I don't necessarily see how Brock Bowers will fit now in this offense, but maybe in the future he will find himself in a higher tier. And then guys going down the list, Goddard, Pat Freiermuth, TJ Hawkinson. That's a kind of a weird group. I like perhaps Pat Freiermuth the most because he's perhaps the second option in that Steelers offense as a receiving threat. And then Hawkinson is also a weird because he's on the physically unable to perform list, might miss at least 4 games. We'll talk about him a little bit more as Shep Easy's sweet spot. IMO, Freiermuth is interesting for a bounce-back good value pick. I agree with that sentiment. I agree that Pat Freiermuth is going a little bit under the radar because outside of him and George Pickens, I really think that this offense was going to have to focus on getting the best out of Russell Wilson. And when Russell Wilson was in Seattle, they definitely had a lot of interesting tight end concepts while he was there. So having a guy like Pat Freiermuth will be helpful to Russell Wilson because he was named the starter for Week 1 in Pittsburgh. So thank you for that comment. Very astute observation. I agree with that sentiment. But that will just about do it for this segment as well. Coming up next, though, we go into the realm of sleepers and busts. We start off at the quarterback position. Even though, quarterbacks aren't necessarily as quote-unquote highly coveted as some other positions, they still can win or lose you games. And we'll get to the comment from Tap to Learn after the break as well.
Looking for your